Friends, good evening and welcome to First Presbyterian Church of Ann Arbor. I'm Mark. I'm one of the pastors here, and I want to welcome you to tonight's gathering. It's a collaboration within our Faith Formation Committee between our Adult Formation, Youth and Families, and Children and Family Ministries working group. And we are so thrilled to welcome Irene Butter here with us tonight to share her story. From the horrific events of the Holocaust to the ways innocent people continue to be killed in Israel and Palestine today, and the wars throughout generations, her story needs to be told. Irene's story is one we can learn so much from, about honoring the dignity within all people, about learning from our past, and about working for a more just and peaceful world. I'm not going to say too much because I want us to hear from Irene, but Irene is the co-founder of the
Zallenberg
Medal and Lecture Series at the University of Michigan, and one of the founders of Zayatuna, an Arab Jewish women's dialogue group here in Ann Arbor. Thank you, Irene, for being with us, and I'm going to just turn it right over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me. I feel honored to be here this evening, and I am going to tell my story of a Jewish girl growing up during Nazi-occupied Europe. And I wanted to point out that I was 12, 13, and 14 years old when all of this happened. And I call it my journey, which had many stops, but it wasn't a voluntary journey. It was a journey by force. And my family didn't make any decisions in this journey. So in order to clarify that, I'm going to show you a map which has all the points, the destinations of this journey. The next slide. So this is the map. I was born in Germany, in Berlin, and Hitler came to power when I was a very young girl. My parents wanted to escape Hitler, and we moved to Holland at a certain point. But after we had lived in Amsterdam about 3 years, the Nazis invaded Holland, and Holland became a Nazi-occupied country, which means that the Nazis governed and they made all the decisions. And one of the decisions was to accelerate the Nazi persecution of the Jews. So, just to make clear, everything that happened to me during this journey happened because I am a Jew, and this happens to other faiths in other parts of the world, and this is one of the outstanding examples of inhumanity, of persecution, trying to persecute a whole population who belong to this particular faith, namely being Jewish. So my family moved to Amsterdam, and after 2 years, the Nazis occupied Holland, and then 3 years later, my family was deported. The first camp is called Westerbork. It was a German concentration camp in the Netherlands, primarily a transit camp. So most people who came to Westerbork were transported to other camps, primarily in Eastern Europe, and they were called the death camps. So then Westerbork, we were there for 8 months or so, and then we were deported to Bergen-Belsen, a very large camp in Germany. And I will fill in the details later on. So after being in Bergen-Belsen almost 1 year, we became part of an exchange transport. Hitler had an exchange of people like commodities, so we were traded for other people, and that was a stroke of luck. So we were taken on a train to Switzerland, but so in Switzerland we were refugees. We were not wanted and were sent to a refugee camp in Algeria, in North Africa. The war had already ended, but this is what happened. And from North Africa, where I also spent almost 1 year, I came to the United States. And so that is the journey. Now, coming to the United States was the only decision that my family and I made after the war was over. So the reason I tell this story these days, and it's almost 80 years old, is because we were the victim of a dictatorship. And at the present time, we see all over the world, parts of the world, we see a tendency towards authoritarian governments. And that means that one person is elected or not elected to become the dictator of that country, which means that that person makes all the decisions and of how the country should be governed and what should happen to the people. And that's why I'm telling this story, because it is an example of what can happen when you live in a dictatorship, where all your freedom is taken away, all your rights are taken away, and all your property is taken away, and sometimes even your loved ones are taken away. And that's what can happen in a dictatorship, and we should avoid it in any possible way. So I want to tell you a little bit about my family, because the Nazis called the Jews thieves, criminals, pigs, cockroaches, all kinds of hateful names. And so I just want you to see what my family looked like, and they don't look like any of these characterizations. The next slide. So this is a wedding picture of my parents. Going to go through this quickly. The next slide is my brother, 2 years older than I, and myself, and I think I was maybe a year and a half, and he was 3, something like that. Next slide. And this is a picture of my father and myself. At that point, I was 5 years old. I adored my father. He was my idol. He was my hero. He never got angry at me. And I still have the most wonderful memories of my childhood, my father. Next slide. And these are my grandparents. I had the fortune of growing up in the same house with these wonderful grandparents. The picture shows my grandfather holding my brother when he was an infant, and my grandmother holding me when I was an infant. And they were just wonderful. They were playful. They were generous. They had a lot of treats, a lot of surprises. Took us to the zoo and took us on trips. And I have only wonderful memories. So I think I had an idyllic childhood before all of this happens. The next slide. So after Hitler came to power, we wanted to escape the Nazis and decided to move to Amsterdam. My father got a job with the American Express Company, and this is the house we lived in Amsterdam. And I'm showing the picture of the house where Anna Frank lived, because some of you may have read about her or heard about her. And the Frank family also came from Germany. They left to escape Hitler. They settled in Amsterdam. She and I grew up in the same neighborhood. And so you can see even the houses looked alike. The next slide, it is a school picture. Every student in Amsterdam used to get a picture taken like this, sitting at a school desk with a notebook, a pen in the hand, and some kind of a picture hanging behind it. And Anna Frank went to a different school, and that was her photo at maybe the same age. The next slide. Well, so as I mentioned, the Nazis came to, they invaded the Netherlands in 1940, and they took over the government. And there were many rules and regulations that Jews had to follow. And this is the biggest park in Amsterdam at that time. And it says, for Jews forbidden. And so there were many other buildings and parks and swimming pools and other facilities that were forbidden for Jews. We couldn't go to movies, to theaters, to museums, at many other public facilities, and we were not allowed to use any public transportation. People who were not Jewish were not allowed to visit us, and we were not allowed in the homes of people who were not Jewish. There was a curfew. We always had to be in at 8 o'clock in the evening, and Jews were not allowed to go to the food stores until after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was war. There were many scarcities, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, often there wasn't any food left. Now, Holland is a bicycle country. Even these days, when more people own cars, still everybody in the Netherlands rides a bicycle. And at that time, since we couldn't use public transportation, losing my bicycle meant that I was limited to a very short distance and a very small part of the city that I would live in, because you could only go where you could walk to. So that was another big restriction. Also, Jewish kids were exiled from the public schools, and we had to go to Jewish schools. So we were no longer in a school with our neighborhood kids, and the Jewish school was further away. And after I didn't have my bicycle, I had to walk a longer distance every day. But the worst of all was the deportation. And the goal of Hitler and the goal of the Nazis in the Netherlands was to deport every single Jew to a concentration camp, and many of them to execution. So the next slide shows the method that was used by the Nazis to deport Jews. And what it was called a razzia, and a razzia means an incursion into the neighborhood. The neighborhood is blocked off entirely, and everyone has to get off the streets. And then the Nazis go from house to house and from door to door. And when they find Jews, they give us 10 minutes to pack our belongings and then leave the building. And we could only take with us what we could carry. And so here you see how people are marched out of their houses, some carrying suitcases, some carrying bundles. And it's young people, old people, babies and baby carriages. And everyone is being walked to a big square. Now, the day that my family and I were arrested in our neighborhood, which was one occupied by many Jewish residents, we were assembled on a big square, and it was June 20th, a very hot day, and we needed to wait until the Nazis had screened every single house in that neighborhood that consisted of many blocks. And so what I want to point out about this picture is that on the left bottom, you see 2 coffee cups. Now, these are people who live across the street from where the Nazis are deporting Jewish people. And they're sitting there drinking their coffee as they would drink every morning and just watching what's going on. They're not doing anything about it. They're just drinking their coffee. And we call those people bystanders. They're people who see what's happening and they're not doing anything about it. They just turn their back or drink their coffee. So the next slide shows where the Jews were taken. They were assembled on a big square. They were picked up in buses and taken, trucks actually, not buses, and taken to the railway station. And the railway station had this long train, and they were cattle cars. And each of these wagons of the train, they would push Jews into these cars, and sometimes 60, 70 or more people sitting on the floor. There were no seats available. Sometimes there wasn't even enough floor space for everyone to sit, and some people had to sit on the laps of other people. And then once the cattle car was filled, then they would lock the door, and there would be no light because there are no windows in cattle cars. There would be no air, and there would be no water, no food, and no toilets. And that's how people were deported to the concentration camps. In some cases, for days, till they could get to a designated camp in Eastern Europe. In my particular case, we were deported to Westerbork, which might have taken 4 or 5 hours in that train. And we arrived there in the evening. And the next slide shows some pictures of Camp Westerbork. On the left side, you can see the barracks we lived in, and they were lined up. On the right side, you see the interior of the barracks, and they had steel-framed, 3-tiered bunk beds. The only thing on the bed was a straw mattress, and they were very close together. It was a very congested situation. The only space available would be 1/3 of the floor underneath the bunk bed where you could store your belongings. Now, life in Westerbork, the barracks were divided in 2 halves. One half was for men and the other for women and children. And it was only at night that there was separation. During the day, families could be together and they could eat their meals in one barrack, in one side or the other. The adults had work to do, but it was mostly work that had to do with maintenance of the camp. Maybe occasionally there would be construction of a new barrack that was needed, or there was work that had to do with the food, people worked in the kitchen, and there was work with administration of the camp, new people arriving, and other groups being sent further away. For my brother, he became a message boy, and they gave him a bicycle so he could carry messages from one part of the camp to another. And for children my age, there was nothing to do, absolutely nothing. There was no schooling, there were no libraries, there were no toys to play with, no playgrounds. It was complete boredom, and kids could play with each other, but there really wasn't much to do. Now, the worst part of Camp Westerbork was that every Saturday afternoon, a cattle car train pulls in. And the way the camp was structured was that there was a railroad in the middle, and then there were two parts of the camp on either side of the railroad. So every Saturday afternoon, a cattle car pulled in, and it would sit there the rest of Saturday, all day Sunday, and all day Monday. And every time you left your barrack, you would see this ominous train. And then Monday night at 11 o'clock, the barrack leaders would turn on the lights, and they read off a list of names of people who had to leave in that train, that cattle car train, in the morning. And so that was the continuous anxiety experience in Westerbork, because you had to get up at 11 and listen for all the names to see if your name was on the list. And then when it wasn't on the list, my family would usually go to other barracks where we had either relatives or friends and see if anybody was on the list to leave that morning. And if that was the case, we would spend the rest of the night until we would say goodbye, knowing that most likely we would never see them again. And that was the trauma of Westerbork, because every weekend the same thing happened. The train closed in, the barrack leader reads a list of names, the train leaves, and once you haven't been on the list and the train has left, then you know the same thing is going to happen next week. So it was trauma. The whole time it was anxiety, it was uncertainty, and that was Westerbork. The next slide. Well, here you see passports, and I have to explain that passports played a critical role in the life of my family. My father had met a friend one day who had just received passports for him and his wife, and he gave my father the address of a consul in Stockholm in Sweden, and told him to write to that consul, and maybe we could also get passports. So my father did that immediately. He wrote a letter and sent 4 passport pictures to that consul in Sweden. But then June 20th came, and the passports had not arrived. And so we were sent to Westerbork. And then one day, when we had almost completely forgotten about the passports, a package arrived, and my father unwrapped the package, and there were 4 passports to Ecuador. And these were forwarded from our address in Amsterdam, and that's kind of a miracle because it's never been explained, but we didn't get any of our mail forwarded, and there was this package addressed to our home address with these 4 passports. Well, they played such an important role because once the passports came, our status in Westerbork changed. We were no longer just Jews. We became labeled as exchange Jews. Exchange Jews were Jews that had passports or citizenship to allied countries. And the Nazis could use us. We were human capital for the Nazis. And what the Nazis intended, that they could exchange Jews for German citizens who had left earlier in the century for North and South America. And also they could exchange us for German prisoners of war. So we were sent to Westerbork because we were exchange Jews. We were sent from Westerbork to Bergen-Belsen because in Bergen-Belsen there was an exchange camp. And we were told that Bergen-Belsen would be a better camp and that we wouldn't be there very long because the Nazis would exchange us for other people. So the next slide shows what Bergen-Belsen looked like when we arrived there. Well, it didn't look hopeful. We saw people who had anxious expression on their faces. They were very, very thin. They were clothed in rags, and they just didn't look like this would be a better camp. So we were all sent to barracks in Bergen-Belsen, and life began pretty difficult from the very beginning. Even the day we arrived in Bergen-Belsen after a long train ride, we had to go what is called roll call. And roll call was one of the tortures in Bergen-Belsen because it happened at least once a day to be lined up on a big square. Over on the left side, on the top, you can see what's called the Appellplatz. And you had to stand there in rows of 5. And you couldn't move. You had to stand in place. You couldn't talk. And you weren't allowed to do anything. And the counting took place many times for hours and hours, 6, 7 hours, standing in place, rain or shine, summer or winter. It was a form of torture. And this happened every day at least once. If the Nazis were angry or there was punishment, it could be 2 times or 3 times a day. And somehow they could never come up with the right number in counting, and so that's why it lasted so long. So that was the way we were introduced. Now the barracks were very, very crowded in Bergen-Belsen. My parents and all adults had to do slave labor from early in the morning into the evening, 6.5 days a week. They had to go to work. There was only half a day in the week that they were allowed to rest. And slave labor meant they had to go out of the camp. The men had to dig ditches, build new barracks, do all kinds of very hard work. And the women worked in sort of factories, tearing apart old clothing and separating the worn-out parts from the better fabric so that new clothing could be put together. My brother, he worked in what was called the shoe commando, where they had to pile up shoes into big piles that were taken off the victims. And again, for children my age, well, there weren't any schools in Bergen-Belsen, and so my responsibility was taking care of children whose parents were gone all day at labor and helping to clean the barracks, keeping the barracks clean, and doing the laundry for my family because there was no one else who could do it. And doing the laundry was a struggle because we only had cold water. there was no soap, dragging the clothes through cold water and then hanging it up on a wash line and sitting there until the clothes were at least drier, because you couldn't leave anything the outside or it might have gotten stolen. We couldn't afford to lose our clothing. So sitting there to watch clothing could be very cold or very hot and take a very long time. So that's how I spent my days. And then the filth, the hygienic conditions in Bergen-Belsen were deplorable. We were very crowded. There were no showers or anything like that. There were outhouses which were always filthy, and the people became malnourished because the food rations were so small. Everyone got a piece of bread that was about 2 inches wide for the whole day, and then a bowl of soup at night, which was most of the time turnips cooked in water. And so that isn't enough nutrition for people to stay alive. And in addition to that, there were epidemics of infectious diseases. There was cholera, there was typhus, there was polio, there was pneumonia, there were other infectious diseases. The primary infectious disease became typhus. And living close together, being malnourished, and epidemic diseases. So these are conditions for a very high death rate, and survival becomes a big challenge. So life in Bergen-Belsen was extremely difficult, hazardous, I would say. In addition to the lack of food, the poor hygiene, the epidemic diseases, there were many assaults. People got beaten up. They got punished in very cruel ways. And you sometimes wondered, if the Nazis wanted to use us for exchange, then why did they treat us so badly that people died and the death rate became higher and higher? But the next slide. Well, as the camp became more crowded, two people had to share a bed. And these are narrow bunk beds. My father and my brother shared one bed. My mother and I shared another one. And this situation was increasingly horrible, so that towards the end of the year, when I went to bed every night, I was praying that I would wake up the next morning, because each morning I was surrounded by people who had died during the night, and so survival became a real challenge. My parents had gotten ill. My father developed pneumonia, actually, in the first few months in the camp, and maybe he never recovered from it because his health continued to decline. And my mother became very ill also. She became bedridden, and I was taking care of her. And so my brother and I worried, how could we keep our parents alive when the food rations became smaller and smaller, and the work became harder and harder. And of course, my father continued to go to work. He was hospitalized in the beginning of his pneumonia, but there was no treatment, and the only advantage of being in the hospital is that you could rest all day, but then he was discharged and he went back to work. Well, so it took more than 11 months that we were in Bergen-Belsen, and we were included in an exchange. And that was because we had these passports. There was an announcement that everyone who had a passport needed to report to a Nazi doctor to be screened for this transport that was going to be leaving the next day. So my brother and I tried to got our mother dressed and tried to walk her to the screening station, but she collapsed. She couldn't hold up, so we had to take her back to bed. And then my brothers said, well, we should go. You and I should go and report to the doctor. And so we were approved for the exchange transport that was to leave the next day. My father was still at labor, and when he came back in the afternoon, you could tell something had happened to him. He just looked very sick, and he could barely walk. And so he said that he needed to rest. He couldn't go and see anybody. And then after a while, we begged him, my brother and I begged him that he would come. And leaning heavily on my shoulder, he walked with me to that screening doctor. And they asked him, are you ill? And he said no. And it was such a ridiculous question, thinking of how ill he really looked and how faded he was. But then the doctor, he looked at me and he said, well, your children have already been here, so the four of you get ready. You'll be leaving the camp tomorrow. And that was another miracle, that the doctor apparently mistook me, I was 14, for a 46-year-old woman. Of course, we were both highly underweight. We had rags as clothing because that's what happened to our clothing. But how he would have mistaken me for my mother, but it was a miracle, and that's how we got out of the camp, the four of us. The next day, my mother couldn't walk anymore, but there were friends who were willing to help her get to the train. And so the next day, we were able, as a family of four, were able to leave this hell of Bergen-Belsen. The next slide shows the train that was there. This is a drawing that a student made, the good train, the Red Cross train that took us out of Bergen-Belsen. And this train, it was heated. We were served warm food, real food, not turnip food. And we were beginning to hope that maybe we are really going to a better place. The Nazis also told us we could take this Star of David off our clothing, which we were required to wear the whole time. But then after we were on this train for 2 days, the second night, my father died on the train. And he had done so much to save his family. And we were so close to freedom, but he couldn't make it. And then his remains were taken off the train and put on a bench in that railway station you see on the slide. And my mother was barely conscious, and we had really no choice but to continue on this train. And 2 days later, we arrived in Switzerland. My mother and my brother were so sick, they were taken off the train and taken to a hospital immediately, but I was not allowed to stay with them I was not that sick, and so I had to go along with the other people who were liberated from Bergen-Belsen, who were not sick enough to be hospitalized. And we were in Switzerland for a couple of days and then put on a train to Marseille in the south of France and put on a ship that took us to North Africa, to Algiers, because in Philippeville is a town in Algiers, there was a refugee camp. Now the war had not ended, and that's where we were taken to spend the rest of the time before the war ended. Then, after the war ended, there was an administration of that camp that saw to it that people could return to the destination of their choice. Some wanted to go back to Holland or France or Belgium. Some went to South Africa. And I was hoping that my brother and my brother, who luckily recovered after some time, that either they would come to this camp or that I would be able to return to Switzerland so we could be reunited, but that did not happen. And so after the administration of the camp did whatever they could, but we had family in the United States, and they provided visas. Eventually, I was able to board a ship to come back to America, but my mother and my brother were still in Switzerland. So, at the next slide, it shows that, what does it show? Oh, these are the only pictures I have of the camp in Algiers. It certainly was not comparable to Bergen-Belsen in any way at all. It was a difference between night and day. We had freedom. We slept on beds with sheets. We got 3 meals a day. We got new clothing. The camp was, it was livable. The camp was situated on top of a hill, and we could leave any time we wanted. And if we walked down the hill, there was a gorgeous beach of the Mediterranean where, when the weather became warm enough, we could go swimming. And that's where I learned to swim, actually. And here is the picture shows the barracks that we lived in, which were a little different. And then a picture with young people my age who hang out together and spend a lot of time on the beach. So after 11 months and the war was over, I was able to come to America on a Liberty ship. These were ships built in 48 hours, and mostly to support the troops in Europe. And next slide shows a picture of that ship. And it took 21 days on a very turbulent ocean. And I arrived in Baltimore, and then I met my relatives that I was to live with on Grand Central Station in New York City, and they were just wonderful to me. They couldn't have been any better. They helped me adjust to a new life in America, made sure I could go to school, to high school as soon as possible. They helped me learn the language. They helped me learn about new customs. And it took 6 more months before my brother and my mother came to the United States. And there was a tremendous housing shortage in New York, so it took another year before we were able to find an apartment and live together. In the meantime, my brother lived with cousins, and my mother and I lived in rented rooms, but eventually we were together again as a family. So I went to high school right away, and in 2.5 years I graduated from high school. And luckily, New York City at that time had tuition-free colleges, so that way I was able to pursue my college education. We were very poor. The Nazis had taken everything away from us. My mother had to take a minimum wage job after she'd never worked in her life before. My brother took a job with an insurance company and went to school at night to finish high school, and I went to school during the day and had after-school jobs. So that way we managed to pay our bills. And luckily my mother and my brother recovered and again learned to live this new life in New York City. And the next slide. So I graduated from high school. During my college years, I worked every summer in the Catskills, an resort area where people had vacations in the summer. I worked as a waitress, and the job was very demanding every day from early morning till into the night, and no weekends off. So I had no chance to spend any money, and then I came home with, I think, $500 or more. At $500, you could purchase a lot more than you can today. So, can't see what the slides are. Next slide. So after I graduated from college, I went to Duke University. I was able to get assistantships. This is where I met my husband. And so we both got our PhDs at Duke University. Next slide is my children, my daughter and my son. This was when they were little. Now they have their own children. And that's the next slide. I have 2 granddaughters and a grandson. And the lower slide shows 3 great-grandchildren. And at this point, there are 4. So I've had the benefit of a wonderful family with grandchildren as well as great-grandchildren. The next slide. So my degrees in economics, and this is a picture of me teaching economics at the University of Michigan long time ago. The next slide. And so this is a historic picture. I like to show it because it shows we made some progress. I was teaching in the School of Public Health, and this is my department was hospital administration. It's graduation day, and the front row you see the students. They are all men. White men with suits, white shirts and ties. Behind them is the faculty, and also they are all white men with suits and ties and white shirts. And then over on the right, that's me. And I'm the only woman in the department, and I can tell you that the same picture today would look very different. Probably more than half the students would be women, and the student population is far more diverse now than it was then, and probably something like 1/3 of the faculty would also be female. So this is a historic picture, and it shows that things have changed in this country in that direction. The next slide. So my brother has two children, and my two children, one day at a family reunion, our children wanted us to take them on a trip to the sites of family history. And at first we were shocked because neither my brother nor I had ever thought of going back to those places. But then we decided we should take our children, and it was a really amazing, eye-opening journey for us. And Bergen-Belsen was sort of the highlight, in a way, of this trip, because here was the place where we were supposed to die, and then we come back with our children, and it was a real feeling of triumph to show them this place. And even my granddaughters were able to see this place. Actually, we went to Berlin, we went to Amsterdam, we went to Westerbork, to Bergen-Belsen, and then the next slide shows it shows some more pictures of Bergen-Belsen. There you see a mass grave. And when the Allies, the British troops, came to liberate Bergen-Belsen, they found 30,000 dead bodies all over the grounds of the camp. And the only way they could bury them was in mass graves. So this is a picture of an example. 500 people are buried under this stone, and there are quite a few other mass graves on the grounds. And there, next to it is a gravestone dedicated to Margot and Anne Frank. Now, they both died in Bergen-Belsen, and this is not the place where they would have been buried, but after the war, they allowed relatives to put up these stones for the people who died there. And you can see many people have visited and left little things in front of that gravestone. Then the next slide shows we also went to the town where my father is buried, a town called Laupheim in southern Germany. And here we are at the grave of my father, who is buried in a Jewish cemetery. And the picture on the left is my brother and myself, his children, and my son. And then on the right side is my daughter and one of the granddaughters who also came to visit the grandfather. And it's an interesting place because over the years, I have been there about 6 times, and the last few decades, the caretaker is a wonderful person, always welcomes me. He and his wife and his daughter have become friends, and we correspond even when I'm not able to visit there. And it is a beautiful cemetery that it has a funeral home that was renovated, used as an education center. And the high school students in this town, twice a year, they're invited to come and help clean up the cemetery and learn about the Holocaust and what happened here. The next slide. Well, here we have a quote from Elie Wiesel, who is one of the most important spokesperson for Holocaust victims and survivors. And what he one time I heard him speak, and this particular sentence made a deep impression on me. He said, if you were at the camps and if you smelled the air and heard the silence of the dead, then it's your responsibility to be a witness and to tell your story and give testimony, because if you do not do this, then the victims of the Holocaust will die twice. And it made a deep impression on me. And the first 40 years of my life in the United States, I was not allowed to talk about the Holocaust. Whenever I said something, I was told to keep silent. People were not ready to hear about it. And even my mother, my brother, and I rarely talked about it. So from then on, the 1980s, I have been speaking to students and to other populations. And I continue to feel that this is my duty to remain a witness and to tell people what happened during the Holocaust. The next slide. Well, as time went on, I began to realize how fortunate I was to survive when 6 million Jews were killed. And so I became involved in some peace work and helped to create an endowment at the University of Michigan in memory and to honor Raoul Wallenberg, who was a Swede who came to study at the University of Michigan from 1931 to 1935. And later on in his life, he was appointed as a diplomat in Budapest to save as many Jews as he could save, when Budapest was one of the few cities left that had a Jewish population. So what you see here is the medal that was made by a member was faculty of the School of Art. It's a golden medal, and he's said to have saved 100,000 Jews in 1944 in Budapest by housing them in what he called safe houses that he declared Swedish property, and the Nazis were not allowed to enter. And he issued thousands of passports, Swedish passports, to Jews to pull them off the trains that were headed for Auschwitz and saved them with these passports. And so he is my biggest World War II hero because he made tremendous sacrifices and he had tremendous courage. And then he was captured by the Russians at the end of World War II, and he was executed in a Russian prison. So it's a sad story, but it's also a very memorable story of what he did in saving 100,000 Jews. We honor him every year with the invitation of a outstanding humanitarian who represents voices that are suppressed and who have fought hatred and who have protected vulnerable populations. And so now I think we are in our 25th year of having on campus a Wallenberg speaker, and there will be one this fall, and it'll be widely publicized, and they are always extraordinary people. We have a few pictures of Wallenberg medalists. The next one is the Dalai Lama. He was one of the medalists who came here, and I had the great honor of meeting him personally. And he certainly stands for peace and for compassion and for understanding of human beings. The next slide shows some other Wallenberg medalists. On the left side is Brian Stevenson, who is an attorney who has dedicated his life to saving innocent prisoners on death row, and that's what he does. That's his life. And then there's Lydia Cacho. She was a medalist from Mexico, and she has fought against trafficking of women and written a book about trafficking all over the world. And then on the lower level, there's Me Please, and she was the woman who sheltered Anna Frank and her family in the attic. And she came here. I think she died a few years later. She was 101 or 102 years old. She had tremendous courage and fortitude to provide them shelter and sustenance in the attic, where she visited the family almost once a day. And then there is John Lewis, a very well-known fighter for human rights and civil rights since the 60s, and he also came here. And he was a congressman and spent all his life working for equality and the rights of people. The next slide is one of the Tuna. It's a group of 6 Palestinian and 6 Jewish women. I think we're now 21 or 22 years old. We meet every other week in each other's homes. We're a dialogue group and discuss difficult topics. And after all these years, we are still together, still learning from each other, sharing each other's pain, and supporting each other in our lives. And the next slide, well, that is, those are my 3 messages, what I have learned from my experience during the Holocaust. Refusing to be enemies, that is the motto of Zaytuna, because most people think that Jews and Palestinians are enemies, and we have shown and we have lived to show that this doesn't have to be the case. And if the world would, or at least some parts of the world, would use this motto of refusing to be enemies, we could all lead better lives. I also want to say, if we are open to meeting other people with other race, other ethnicity, other religion, our lives are enriched because we can learn so much from each other. And the longer we know each other, the more we realize that what we have in common by far outweighs the differences in our skin or our faith or our gender or our age even. So this is a very important message. Not always easy, but it's very worthwhile to try. And the second message is that one person can make a difference. Each one of us can make a difference by being aware of what goes on around us, by fighting against hatred, by helping people who are being isolated, persecuted, discriminated against, whatever it is. And then the third one, never be a bystander. If you see hatred being practiced, if you see discrimination or prejudice or different treatment of people who deserve equality and deserve the same rights that we have, then don't turn your back. Do something about it. So never be a bystander. Like this picture I showed you before, when the people were drinking their coffee while across the street people were being deported. Never be a bystander. And we could live in a better world. And so the last slide is just showing you my book, From Holocaust to Hope. It's called Shores Beyond Shores, From Holocaust to Hope. And I think there's some books here, and I'll be happy to sign them afterwards. It's and biographical. It's been translated into 4 different languages, so it's sold in different countries, and it reaches people, different populations. So is there time to ask questions?
Yes, thank you. If you have a question, if you can pass your piece of paper that you hopefully wrote it on to the center of the aisle, Pastor Hannah is going to walk through. But I do have one question from one of our youth that was asked earlier that we're going to ask again for the entire group, if that's okay.
Sure.
This is one from one of our middle schoolers. Well, first off, thank you for that. That's wow.
That's fine. With its house done. Ooh. That's
So just time for just a few questions. This comes from one of our middle schoolers. If you could go back into the past and talk to the people who caused these things to happen, what would you ask or say to them?
Yeah, well, I appreciate this question. I have never met a Nazi after the war, but if I did, I would ask them, did they commit murder? Did they murder Jews? And some of them who did will probably say no, and they won't even admit it. But if they admitted that they were involved in persecuting for killing Jews, then I asked them, do they agree this was wrong? This was evil. That they shouldn't have done this. And if they say, yes, they admit it was wrong, it was evil, then I ask them, are they willing to make amends? And if that's the case, then I'm willing to forgive.
So our next one says, what was a fun thing that you did as a child?
Fun thing. Well, when I was about 2 years old, 3 years old, I had a little red tricycle, and I loved to ride up and down the street. I remember that. I remember my grandparents. We lived in city, in urban life, but there were gardens that you could rent. And so my grandfather took me once, and I've never forgotten. He took me to plant seeds in the earth. And then after that, and I was able to help plant the seeds. And after that, we went on a walk. And when we came back, there were the radishes and the cucumbers. He just had put them in there to show me that if you plant something, you will get something. And I'll never forget that. And yes, I remember my grandmother took me shopping and bought me fancy dresses that my mother would never have bought me. And so I remember that. Lots of good memories. Picnics, family outings, toys, books. I had an idyllic childhood.
Thank you. From your work with Zaytuna, do you have any thoughts about the current conflict with Israel and Palestine that you'd be willing to share?
Well, my own take on this is one cannot take sides. There is no side. There are only two sides. Both of the peoples have committed murder. Nobody is innocent. So that's my feeling. I have sympathy for both peoples, and I feel the only way the conflict will ever be solved is if we find a way of bringing people to better, to no longer be enemies, because as long as they remain enemies, there will be continuity of war. And war is pointless. It's useless. And it must be ended.
Well, I think that's a fitting way to end this. And if you have other questions or your question didn't get answered, you can get this book, and perhaps you might find a piece of that wisdom in there as well. We're going to have the signing right out here in the Welcome Center. Thank you again, Irene, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
It's from 45.
Welcome to the Rapture. If you just jump up the second to info up there, you can join us, or you can head out to the doors.
Yes.
Sorry, I already. What?